Hello, this is Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American. You're going to like our guest today. This season we've been focused on political reform, talking about the different types of reform that can help heal the divisions in America. But today's going to be focused on data, the data that actually shows that there is a large amount of space in our public policy where people actually can find common ground. The Center for the Future of Arizona has focused on polling, utilizing Gallup as one of their pollsters, that takes a look at how it is that we can find common ground on major issues, including immigration, education, sustainability, and a wide variety of other issues. Now, the person that we're going to have on the show today is Dr. Sybil Francis. She has served in a variety of national leadership roles, including a senior policy director in the U.S. House of Representatives, where she played a key role in energy and environmental and actually even national security policy. She served in the White House Office of Science and Technology, where she focused on national research policies. She's also an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and Global Future Scholar. And Dr. Francis is widely regarded as a visionary leader. She's been recognized as a Woman of Achievement in Business Magazine in 2020, and she's named as one of Arizona's 48 most intriguing women in 2022. Arizona Capital Times twice honored her amongst the Women of Achievers in Arizona and the Leaders in the Year in Public Policy. The Business Journal also recognized her as an outstanding businesswoman in 2021 and in the Lifetime Achievement of Most Admired Leader honoree in 2023. She earned her BA in chemistry from Oberlin College and her PhD in political science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. This is a great guest, very bright, very smart. You're going to enjoy listening to her today. And again, if you're believing that we need to find a way to heal divisions, this is going to be a conversation about an organization that is talking about it from a data perspective of where that ground may actually exist. Dr. Francis, I'd like to welcome you to the Optimistic American show today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I love the title of your show because I'm an optimist.
Well, what I find is that this whole program that you've put together that I'm going to have you describe, the Arizona that we want, it really does a great job of helping people find optimism. In that, we have this society today that is constantly being driven apart. We're being driven apart by our political candidates, by the two political parties, by the nightly news. We're being driven apart by social media. And sometimes it seems like there's no way for us to reconcile, that the differences are just so strong that there's an inability for us to find a place where we come back together. What I love about what your group is doing, and you're going to get to explain this, is that you're using real quantitative data to show where there is extreme common ground, a lot of common ground between the parties. But if you would, why don't you just start with an explanation of your organization and what it is that the Arizona that we want is attempting to do?
Well, thank you so much, Paul. You did a great job really getting to the heart of some of the uniqueness of the work that we do. I think our organization is even more relevant today than it was 20 years ago when we founded it. With my co-founder, Laddie Kaur, who was the former president of ASU, we set out really to do good for Arizona. How do we bring Arizonans together to create a stronger and brighter future for our state? And we pretty quickly realized that as smart as we might be, it really wasn't up to us to decide what was best for Arizona. And we quickly decided that the best thing we could do was really to go straight to Arizonans and ask them what matters to them, to their future. And so really how we do our work is we listen to Arizonans. We share trusted information about how we are doing as Arizonans. We have become a trusted source of really reliable data. We identify important issues that we discover through our research. And then we actually have a doing part. Laddie coined the term do tank for our organization. We don't just think and do research. We actually try to turn good ideas and research into action. So we have partnerships across the state with nonprofit organizations, educational institutions, employers, communities, and others to really try to advance this idea of the Arizona we want.
One of the things that I find fascinating, I have read lots of research and lots of polls by lots of different organizations all over the country. And here's what's easy to find. The first set of polling you can find can tell us where we don't agree. I've seen so much polling on where people are different. I've also seen polling that has shown us, that 70% or 60% of the public support X. But your polling is done in a very unique way, and it is a way that really helps us identify where real common ground is. Can you explain to us the methodology that you actually use before we start getting into the results? Because I think without understanding how you actually do the polling, it's almost impossible to understand how good this data actually is.
Well, absolutely. So we are a very data-driven organization. We are committed to data-based discussion, decision-making, and ultimately data-informed action. So we really put a high value on a rigorous data, and we have from day one. And I think that's become even more relevant today, as you pointed out. But when we decided we wanted to listen to Arizonans, we thought, who is the best gold standard really in the world to partner with, and that was the Gallup organization. And so we partnered with Gallup in the 2008-2009 period to develop what is an absolutely unique, as far as I can tell, a survey, massive survey of Arizona. And so it was very important to us that at the end of that survey, we could speak with confidence, not only what Arizonans overall believed, but that we could speak with confidence about, urban and rural Arizonans, Arizonans of different races and ethnicities, different education levels, different income levels, yes, different political identities, so that no one could say, well, you didn't talk to this group or you didn't talk to that group. So it's very important to us to, minority populations. So it was very important to us to make sure that we listened to everybody and that we could speak with confidence, and that we could also kind of slice and dice the data to see where there might be differences. But what we discovered was that we agree on much more than we disagree, as you said. And just to put into context how massive the survey was, we had 3,500 responses. If you think about those surveys that you see in the newspaper or read about, oftentimes it's maybe 500 respondents or 1,000 or 1,200. 3,500 across the country. So you'll see national surveys that are 1,200 responses. Well, we had 3,500 responses in Arizona. So we can say with confidence that we certainly surveyed a good cross-section of Arizonans. Beyond that, we also were very interested in all the big topics that could be of interest to people about the future. So education, jobs, healthcare, environment, infrastructure, fairness and justice, the economy, the environment. I don't recall if I said the environment. So we covered all the big issues, and we really dug deep into those. This was there's two big surveys we've done with Gallup. We're for the first one in 2009 and the next one in 2020. These were unique and a really big contribution to our understanding of who Arizonans are.
How were you able to parse the data to ensure that if one group really had huge opposition to something, that even though it may be supported by the other group or people who were in the center, that it didn't become part of the Arizona that we wanted? How were you able to look at the data to make certain that, again, that controversial ideas, at least on one side, wasn't being included as something that would be seen as something everyone wanted?
Well, one of the things that came out of, or two important things that came out of our Gallup survey work, and we've done other work more recently around elections that I can also talk about. But in the Gallup survey, we identified what we call shared public values. And we were very strict about how those shared public values, how we determined what they were. We required that any particular shared public value that we identified enjoyed 70% or more support. You cannot get to 70% without buy-in from all the different groups that I just mentioned. It would be impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So we identified the importance of, a strong education system that serves all Arizonans, of quality jobs with education and training, needed to advance careers, of the importance of sustainability and operating in a sustainable way and protecting our environment. It's very interesting how highly Arizonans really value our environment, clean air, clean water.
It's hard for me to believe that we get to 70% on anything. So I'm going to have fun here
Yeah,
trying to figure out
yeah.
where are the areas, although I've cheated. I've kind of read the results, but it's going to be interesting to me to just take a look at and to talk about where do we get to 70% agreement amongst Arizonans?
Yeah, well, one of the things that really jumped out at me was 86% of Arizonans want comprehensive immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship for dreamers. And, this starts begging the question of, if we have such huge support, how is it that we have such huge support, and yet we don't see action on some of these things? But we can get to that a little bit later.
Yeah, so why don't we start with, though, let's just talk about what you just did. Let's talk about the items that ended up at the top of the list, and
Sure.
dig into as much on specifics as you can. Education, immigration, sustainability, any of those issues.
Sure, sure. So education, by the way, before I get into the data, what's interesting to me is I would love to think that in Arizona we're unique and that we have these areas of agreement. I suspect that the kinds of things that I'm going to be sharing are very true across the country. I think Arizona is not necessarily an outlier and may, in fact, be very representative of the country. You may not know that as an outside observer looking at our politics. But what's very interesting is that, I have started picking up on various individual surveys across the country that really, in many ways, reinforce our findings. So, as much as I would like to say we're unique, I think we are not so different. So I'm hoping that anyone who might be listening from elsewhere might think, maybe that's the way it is in my state. But education has always been, or throughout all our surveys research over the last 14 years, a really top priority. And things that are very important to Arizonans are, quality teachers and school leaders in schools. Arizonans want to pay teachers more. They also want more funding in education. And if you look at the action of our over the last 20 years, all the ballot initiatives that have come forward to the people have supported more funding for education. That action has not necessarily been parallel in the legislature, so that's kind of an interesting phenomenon. I already mentioned immigration, strong support for immigration reform. The highest value that Arizonans put on issues around education is they want to see a functional working border for commerce as well as for immigration. They feel that system is not working and they want to see it. By contrast, building the wall did not meet our criteria. They did not reach the level of consensus that we require to get onto this agreement agenda, if you will. Arizonans trust our election system. We asked about elections right in the middle of the 2022 election. Arizonans, more than 70% of Arizonans think our election systems are working. Do they think, we might tinker and make them more secure? Sure, but they love our mail-in ballot system. They like early voting. They actually support issuing voter registration at the time of getting your driver's license. So Arizonans enjoy the convenience and security of voting by mail in their current voting system. On environment, very interesting things stand out. 74% of Arizonans support transition to clean energy. And what was interesting about that was we saw that the Latino population, in fact, on all environmental issues, felt even more strongly than the general population. So if 74% of Arizonans on balance support a transition to clean energy, it was something like 76 or 77% of Latino respondents. So that was very interesting. But 80% of Arizonans want cleaner air. They're very concerned about the rising heat in our state. So those are some of the examples around the environment. On water, which we know is very important. 95% of Arizonans are concerned that we're going to be running out of water, and they very much want their leaders to be addressing this issue. So those are some of the few highlights from our survey. that just scratches the surface. If you want to see more of the data, you can go to our website. But it was very stunning how much agreement we had on education. Healthcare was also a shared public value, affordable healthcare for all with no restrictions on pre-existing conditions. And Arizonans very much want accessible mental health care.
To me, this falls in line with what I saw in being mayor. If you take issues like sustainability and the environment, I understand there's no doubt that climate change ends up being a very controversial issue. But when you ask people, do you want clean air? Do you care about the haze that you see in the valley? Are you concerned about the global heat island and the amount of heat that we're emanating? It becomes overwhelming that people care about the environment. It's not even it's a majority of both people in both parties. And I think oftentimes part of our mistake is that on any given issue, we tend to look at the fringes. We look at the issues on the fringes, not recognizing that if we can just go get that low-hanging fruit, there's so much that we agree upon. But we spend time arguing about the margins that we lose our ability to make progress where people do agree.
That's absolutely what we found in our data. And, there are certain terms that just become very politicized. So we did not use the word climate change in our survey. We did exactly what you said. Was we asked about clean air, we asked about clean water, and it's very clear that vast majorities, anything that I'm mentioning here, is supported by Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. We're not cherry picking data. We're not. We don't use lopsided support as evidence of support overall. We really, as I mentioned, for our shared public values, has to be 70% or above. And then we haven't had a chance to talk about the Arizona voters agenda yet, but there we require 50% agreement that an issue should rise to the level of attention at the policy level.
All right, let's talk about the Arizona voters agenda. It's a perfect time for it to come
Sure.
in. Give us an explanation of first how you're looking at that and what the hope and the goals are of it.
Yeah, so I've kind of become a little addicted to data since we did this Gallup survey, and because the Gallup survey is so massive and so extensive, we really can't be doing it every year. It's expensive, it's a lot of planning, it's a lot of implementation. So we thought, would it be interesting and kind of fun to take some of the same issues within the context of a political election campaign and ask Arizona's likely voters what they wanted candidates for office to be addressing and the kinds of things they'd like to see addressed in policy when those officials were elected. And so many of the questions paralleled those from the Gallup survey, but they were a little bit more tuned into some of the more current issues that were being discussed. So it was very, very interesting. To make it onto the agenda, we required that there be strong support across the entire population of Arizonans, likely voters, of 50% or more. If you think about it, it's an election, 50%. If you win over 50%, you win. So we weren't quite as, for our shared public values that are long lasting, 70% was the benchmark. But for the Arizona voters agenda, we just wanted to say this is what a majority of Arizona's likely voters care about. So not only 50% across the board, we also required that there at least be strong support or somewhat support within each of the political parties and subgroups. So that avoided lopsided issues. So for example, if you had one issue that was at 90% with one political party and 10% of the other, on average, that comes out to 50%. But in our book, that didn't count as agreement because it was too heavily weighted for one political party. So we said every political party, likely voter, we had to have that average of strong support for each issue. So what was fascinating was it was a really interesting check on our Gallup data. We worked with a award-winning Arizona-based polling organization called High Ground, very well known for their political polling. But I think this was a very unique project for them. And we did ask similar questions regarding education funding, environmental issues, attitudes towards our elections, and it was very consistent with our Gallup data, meaning that we found many of the same issues that were supported. So it was very interesting in the midst of this very hotly contested 2022 election to be sharing this information, because that's really what our model of change is sharing data to inspire deeper thinking and equip leaders with better information to make better decisions.
And what's the goal of the program? Is it to actually begin to have an effect on public policy itself, or just to provide the data? Of course, providing the data can have an effect on public policy.
Yes, so we are a nonpartisan organization, so we don't lobby, we don't develop solutions. Our model of change about how we contribute to change is by illuminating what Arizonans care about, what likely Arizona voters want from their elected officials. So we're kind of in this for the long haul. This doesn't necessarily change things immediately, but I think what we're interested in is the mental models we have about ourselves as Arizonans. So, for example, you talked about how polarized and divided we are. We see ourselves as pushing back on that narrative and saying, wait a second, all our data, and this is not just some one unique poll. For 14 years, we've been surveying Arizonans. Arizonans are not polarized and divided over these really fundamental questions. And so our hope is that we, by influencing how people see ourselves, they'll start questioning. They'll say, I've been asked this question myself, for many years now. Well, if that's what Arizonans think, why don't they just vote for that? And I was kind of stumped on that question, for honestly. Many people are skeptical of what they hear, because what they hear from us is kind of in cognitive dissonance with what they're hearing from the media and from
Definitely.
politicians. But I've had confidence in our data all these years because we keep seeing it over and over, and we do get indicators from other polling around the country that this is a reality, that in fact we as Americans are not as polarized and divided. And as you said earlier, we are so focused on the outliers and the extremes, and there's something in our system that drives us to pay attention to those voices and not to the majority of voices. And so one of my hopes is that this will help raise that question about, well, why is that? Why are our politics not reflecting who we are? Because of course we are a representative democracy. So why is it that there seem to be these big gaps?
And do you have an answer for that, or a thought about that, or a theory?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that if you think about how we elect our leaders, it's very much favors those who speak to the base. It's almost become part of our vocabulary, so accepted that no one even questions it. Why is it that people running for office first speak to their base and then they pivot to the general election? It's just kind of an odd thing when you think about it. And so I think this is true, with both parties. There's this focus on the base, and then those who can successfully and persuasively pivot to trying to address the general electorate get elected. But the problem is that, they've been elected through the primary system on the basis of those voices that are not necessarily the majority, and in fact are likely a minority voices. So I think that's one really important thing, in addition to the fact that certainly in Arizona, in round numbers, we're about a third Democrat, Republican, and independent. And, in Arizona, the independents can vote in the partisan primaries, but they have to request a ballot. So the result of that is that they only voted about half the rate of the registered Democrats and Republicans. So if you start doing the calculations, if you have, let's say in a primary, maybe you have 50% turnout. I'm just kind of doing a hypothetical here. So if you're in a primary in the Democrats, let's say you're a third of the population, half of that is 15% of the population. And then if you're a candidate that won by half the votes, you won by 8% of the votes of a partisan primary. And if you go on to be elected to a statewide office, you were launched to that statewide office on the basis of 8% of voters.
Yeah, and it's compounded by the idea that at least in the legislature, where people run for 90 different seats, 85% of them, almost 90% of them, are gerrymandered to the point where there is no general election. So two things happen in that process.
Yes.
One is
Yes.
they only number one, they only have to get the votes from people within that 8%. So they're incentivized to reflect that set of values more than the general election values. But I also believe that, I don't always, I don't think that it's always necessarily a cynical point of view. When those candidates don't have to go talk to people in the other party, they really don't even understand where they're coming from. It's the disconnect is so big because they really truly don't understand where those other voters are coming from because they never have to even speak to them, to address them. There's no doubt
Right.
if you have to go address people in the other party or address independents, you have to shake their hand, you have to ask them for your vote. They will tell you what they think. And when they tell you what they think, you begin to formulate or you begin to look for ways to find common ground. You begin to look for ways to work things out, which are why governors are better than that than the legislature, because governors almost always have an opponent in the general election. But in legislative seats or in congressional seats, 85 to 90% of them never even face an opponent. And that means they're not focused on the agenda that Arizonans want. They're focused on the agenda that the group of people that vote for them inside of a partisan primary want. It's just a different way of looking at the issue.
That's right. And it's even gotten to a point now in our politics that many politicians are actually punished for trying to work in a bipartisan fashion. So that's an additional problem. But people have said to me, "Well, why don't we have better people running for office? Or can't you just educate people about this?" And yes, of course, we try to educate legislators, governors, and others about these data. The challenge is it's actually not about their understanding. They're actually, in a somewhat rational way, responding to the incentive structure that they're operating in. And that is that to get elected, you must speak to your base because that's who votes in primary elections. So yes, we need to increase civic engagement. We need more people voting. We need more people engaged in the process. But the system itself is designed in a way that kind of works against representing the majority. Now, I know that there's many people also focused on, districting and that kind of thing. That is also a big factor in the kinds of outcomes that we have.
My this is just my experience. I have met a great many legislators, and for that matter, a great many people in Congress. Um, I do hear people all the time saying, "Oh my gosh, these people are disconnected." That's really not my experience. Most of the
Right.
people that I've met, they're pretty decent people. It's not about bad people. It's about a bad system.
Absolutely. And I think they're responding to the what it takes to get elected.
Mhm,
If you need to speak to this group of people to get elected, then that's what you're going to do.
mhm. All right, so here's something that's challenging to me. So you have this data, and this data kind of shows the area where common ground can be found, but it's not picked up. The news media tends to not focus on it. What's your idea behind why that is so? Why is it that even though you could give them this data, they're going to still go focus on the areas where we're divided?
Well, the media and politicians running for office and even politicians in some ways are responding to the same incentive structure, which is focusing on where there's controversy. It's kind of discouraging, but that seems to be the financial model by which the media succeed. Especially the cable news channels. So I that seems to be the financial model under which they operate.
Yeah, I love Fox News said CNN hates America, and I think they're half right. I think CNN hates half of America, and Fox News hates the other half, right?
The other half,
Because they're playing the partisan game, and the partisan game is how do we pick sides? And there's no doubt niche politics and niche business works. If you go appeal to a niche and give them exactly what they want, they'll reward you with being a patron. But the challenge is it's not really about, it's not designed to try to pull us together. It's not designed to be able to find common ground.
it'd be very interesting if we had an election system. I know that there's open primaries and ranked choice voting that are providing models wherein they are actually designed in such a way that to enhance the likelihood of electing politicians who represent the majority of voters. It'd be very interesting to see in cases where that's been done. For example, in Alaska, has the news coverage changed? Because would the news be more likely to cover the front runners in such a system and how they were doing? So it's possible that the news media are also kind of being pulled into this polarized system of politics.
Yeah, it's a. I mean, I found this is not a new thing. When I was mayor, clearly, there's always this sense that from people that they don't like the guy on the other side of the boat, right? And the thought is that if they could just get them to submerge into the water, their side would be better. Not paying attention to the fact that we're all kind of sitting in the same boat, right? Like it or not, we all are going to suffer a part of the consequence together. And the other thing that I think the existing system misses is that this place is big enough for all of us. I mean, if we are not really fighting over a diminishing pie, that would be a problem. When you're in an environment where things are contracting and shrinking, and there's less resources and there's less of an ability to fix the problems, that can be a political situation that is impossible to fix. That's not what's going on, certainly in Arizona, and for that matter, throughout the United States. We are very fortunate to have a growing economy where there's lots of opportunity. The real question is making certain that we're able to sustain that. And my own personal opinion is, if you look around the country, there's no doubt that one of the biggest divisions that have happened in our country are people who have a college degree and people who don't. And that division has it's created real economic consequences. The people who end up not being able to share in the fruits of gaining a college education, they not only have jobs that aren't as good, jobs that are more difficult, harder economic opportunities, they actually live shorter periods of time. They're affected in a much more dramatic way. And what's hopeful is, you look at your data and the public gets it. They look at that and they say, no, we want this economic opportunity for everyone. They get that education plays a huge role in that process. And that's the way that we get to healing. That's the way that we bring up groups, regardless of what group they're in, whether they're minorities or whether they're part of the majority population. But politicians who are focused on the divisions, oftentimes because of the system that they have, they don't get it. They're missing it. They're missing what it is that we need to do to pull us back together.
Absolutely. Education is such an interesting example. It was very important to us to make sure we understood the viewpoints of Arizonans on education, because, you hear so much, again, in the media, oh, it's not that important to continue your education beyond high school and these sorts of things. But, we had very powerful numbers of Arizonans in the high 70s, I'm not recalling the exact number right now, but who said, yes, we understand that it's important to get an education beyond high school. So there's no doubt that people understand that. 79% of Arizonans think it's important to close the gaps that we have in educational outcomes between those high achievers and vulnerable populations, low income minority populations. So people understand the value of education. They understand the value of education to their quality of life, to their health outcomes, to their income, to their longevity. I think it's a very small percentage of people who are incarcerated, who have a college degree. So there's so many positive correlations with your educational level. And people understand that, even at a time when, I know in Arizona, there's been reductions or, flatlining of investments in universities and other things.
All right. So I'm just going to say, before I make this next comment, I know that your organization hasn't, on any of those issues involving ranked choice voting or other items, I know you haven't taken a position, and you may never take a position on those issues. What I found to be fascinating, I used to be a Democrat. I'm a registered independent today. And one of the things that bothered me within the Democratic Party was the disconnect between the social programs that we wanted and the market that we needed to be able to have to pay for those programs. And so being a supporter of business and entrepreneurship and people being able to create and innovate, which of course is directly tied to our universities and our educational system, that those things were, there was a symbiotic relationship between those items that were connected. And oftentimes I felt within the extreme group in the Democratic Party that voted in the primary, they had a dislike for the capitalistic system. Well, I became an independent. I went out, and later on I helped John McCain, who ran in a primary election, and he was running again for senator. And we went out and did a poll. And one of the questions that we asked in this poll that was a fascinating question, it was, we said that a young girl ran out into the street. She gets hit by a car. She's rushed to a hospital. We asked the question, when she's rushed to the hospital, should the hospital have to identify the nationality of the young girl before administering emergency medical services? Now, good news, that's not legal. That's not why we were polling it. We weren't trying to poll it because anybody was proposing that. What we were trying to do was to figure out how extreme this issue was on the issue of immigration. That's what we were trying to figure out. And here's also good news. Amongst the majority, it was 75, 80% of the public said, that's ridiculous. Why would you do it? Mm-hmm. Here's the bad news. The overwhelming majority of the people who would vote in the primary, not the overwhelming majority of Republicans, don't confuse that. The overwhelming majority of the people who would vote in the primary said, yes, they should, right? Mm-hmm. The point is that oftentimes within those extremes, there's anger about the other side. There is vitriol. They are divided. They really don't like the other side. They see the other side they see every issue as being existential. If that group gets in charge, the country's over, the state's over. Consequently, they preach that message. But it's not who the majority of us are. It's just not, right? And whatever reform we're going to pass, I'm obviously a big supporter of getting rid of partisan primaries and moving to a ranked choice voting. But I don't wake up at night thinking, boy, ranked choice voting is really cool. I wake up at night thinking, hey, how do we bridge these divides? How do we find a way for us to move forward? How do we find a way to get things done that are important, recognizing that we are in an incredibly good economic position and an ability to do those things if we want. We can accomplish untold things in this country, and we have. We just have to find a place for common ground to be able to do it.
Absolutely. And, I've been sitting with these data for 14 years, and I haven't seen any solution that is that's better or more promising than the open primary ranked choice voting system, because I'm a big believer that systems very much influence outcomes. So if you're making cars, what you get out at the end is very much influenced by that production line. Well, it's the same thing with our elections. What is the production line, if you will, equivalent of how we elect our leaders? And you can be the best leader and you will get chewed up in that system if you don't respond to the incentives as they're designed in that system. And right now, that incentive structure is to respond to this minority of voices, whatever the party is. This is not a party thing. Parties can continue and be strong, but how do we make sure that the election process itself or the system is electing people that are representative of the voters? So if you're in a very Republican state, you're going to be driving to who are the Republicans who are most representative of the population. There's some states that are more liberal and democratic. Well, those people will elect Democrats who are more representative of them. So it's not about parties, but it's about how do we represent the majority of Arizonans. And I despair when I see our data and I see the huge gaps between what Arizonans say they care about and what we hear about from political candidates in elections, what we see the legislature focusing on, and what the outcomes of many of these political debates are.
Yeah, I will tell you, Dr. Francis, my opinion is the work that you're doing there is maybe more important than the work that we're trying to do to reform the system, because yours is data-based. All right, I've had a feel for a very long time that we're missing the ability to find an agenda where we can pull people together. But to be honest with you, that agenda is hard to put your finger on. It's hard to put your finger on. Well, what is it that we agree on? You've taken
Yeah.
those issues, applied data to them, and given people the ability to look at it so that they can think about, well, okay, one, we should do this. Why aren't we picking the low-hanging fruit? And last, what is it that's keeping us from being able to do that? It's oftentimes hard to get people to a solution, but if you can get them to the data first, where they look at it and say, okay, we're challenged in being able to do the things that we obviously should be able to do. So from my standpoint, I think the work that you're doing there is actually more important than the work we're doing here. It's arguable about which reform is right. What's not arguable is that the data says that the public wants something better.
Absolutely. And what I've had the experience of presenting to groups of Arizonans, and I have had such emotional responses from some people. They said, "Oh my gosh, thank you for sharing this, because I always knew that this was really who we are as Arizonans. We're not these people that are described in the national media or who are so polarized and divided." On the other hand, it's been a slightly disturbing experience to brief some elected leaders who find it kind of interesting, but not necessarily all that, they're not all that passionate about it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, I think it's because it may actually be irrelevant to them what the majority of Arizonans care about, because the way they get elected is through these stronger voices in the minority in primaries. And so, you can't blame them because they're responding to the system, as we said earlier. But I've had really interesting different responses from different groups of people to this information.
Where do you see your work going forward?
So we want to really double down on these surveys, especially in the election cycle. So this was an experiment. Our Arizona Voters Agenda in 2022 was an experiment. We wanted to see what we would find out. And then was it of interest? It was of huge interest. And so we really want to double down on that, because I think, as I said, much of our work is about how do we change our mental models about who we are based on data, and then what do we do with that information. So to me, if enough people start asking the question, well, actually, this seems really real. Like, we really do agree on these things. So why aren't we seeing more action on those things? Why aren't we getting the outcomes that we say we want? And through that questioning, our hope, of course, is that people will be taking actions to make those changes that are needed. Maybe it's election reform. Maybe we really do need to think about how do we elect our leaders, and so that they are more responsive to what the majority of Arizonans want. So we're really going to double down. We're already planning for the 24 election. Another thing that I am very interested in is, given all the attention that's going to be paid to Arizona on the national scene in 2024, because we are this pivotal state now. What a change from 20 years ago when we were kind of this sleepy entity in national elections. We now are one of those states that everyone's going to be looking at how it turns out. I want to take advantage of that to help educate the national media about who Arizonans are, because when I moved here from New York City, it was all about the fires, running out of water, and then more recently, some of our extreme politics. And so, not to take away from the things that those are very real things for the reasons we discussed, but also, who are we as Arizonans? I'd really like to help educate the national media on that. And then this isn't really the focus of our discussion today, but we have carved out what we call an action agenda, which is our contribution as a center to achieving the Arizona we want. And so we have very deep, extensive statewide programs in education, workforce, and civic engagement. So we have about 11 active programs that impact hundreds of thousands of students every day, hundreds of school leaders. We've partnered with 100 employers, worked in communities. So, we are very passionate about the things that matter to Arizonans, and we're trying to make our contribution to making that change. And we're very much focused on systems change. You won't be surprised, because of my belief that systems are really the greatest, changing systems are the greatest leverage to really impactful change.
How do people get involved? You said you have an action agenda. I know that one of the things I hear from people all the time is they really want, they don't mind volunteering. They'd like to take part, but they want to be involved in something where they feel like there's a constructive change taking place. How can people take part in the organization?
Well, I think the biggest thing that people can do is to access our data and our findings and figure out what does this mean for wherever I'm sitting. We've worked with nonprofit organizations, foundations, employers, government entities, municipal entities, and they have used this information to inform themselves and then also set goals. So, one of the things we didn't talk too much about is what we call the Arizona progress meters. So, we know what Arizonans want, and then we decided, well, if we know what Arizonans care about, we need some way of easily talking about, well, how are we doing? So we developed these Arizona progress meters that are on our website. And I think the education progress meter is a great example that we designed and developed in partnership with an organization called Education Forward Arizona. You can go to our website and you can see data on all the key metrics of how we're doing in our statewide in education, but you can also dig down into your school setting. How's my school doing in third grade reading, in eighth grade math, high school graduation, college going, college attainment? So we pick, for each of these progress meters, we pick a curated representative set of metrics that can give you a snapshot on how we're doing. We have very successfully shared those progress meters and the data curated for various communities and organizations, and they use it to help design their own goals and ways to measure how they progress on those. So for example, there's an organization called Westmark, which is a business group in the West Valley. They wanted to develop a quality of life progress meter, and so we worked very closely with them to help them develop metrics for how they can improve their community and how they measure and report on that. We have a close relationship with an organization called the State of Black Arizona. So as I mentioned, our Gallup data is so rich that we can actually, even though the population of African Americans in Arizona is relatively small compared to other states, we have very valid data, scientifically valid data from Gallup and through our progress meters that we can share with that group so that they can see how are Black Arizonans doing? Where do we have work to do? Where are we doing well? So this is a very, very significant way that others can get engaged. We worked with the Arizona Community Foundation when they did their strategic planning retreat, and they sat with our data, discussed it, and figured out where should their investment priorities as a foundation be. So those are, it's not your pounding the pavements type of volunteering or reading to a child, but it is a very powerful transformative way to impact wherever you are coming from in your interests in your community.
Well, I'll tell you what I love about it. It's the mindset. We talked about polling. One of the fascinating things, there's a great book that talks about the divisions in America, and their argument was that they're not as great as what we believe they are as well. But one of the questions they pointed out was that the news networks like to do this poll that will ask people, all right, if your daughter were going to date a Trump person, how would you feel about it? Or if your son was going to date a Hillary person, how would you feel about it? And it's like 80% of them said that they would be opposed to it. Well, this group of researchers decided to take that further, and a few things that they found. The first one was the people that they were polling were the people that were in the parties. Well, 44% of America is an independent, right? If you don't poll them, you're gonna skew the results. You're gonna get the results of 60% of America. Then they only polled high efficacy voters, high efficacy primary voters. Well, that changes the results again. But then they just added a little bit to the question. They said, okay, so your son is going to date a person who is a woman who liked Hillary Clinton, and you're a Trump supporter, you're a Republican. How would you feel about that if you knew that she was working hard in school and that she had really good values and that she loved your son? Well, the results even amongst the high partisans begin to change when you ask the question that way. So if your goal is to make the divisions bigger, you can do that. You can utilize research to do that. And unfortunately, I think that's where our news media is today. I think that we're at this stage where there's a desire to create the divisions. We have to have optimists. We have to have people who believe that, hey, there's a space for all of us where we can find common ground, where we can help one another. That has been fundamental to the American experiment since our inception. Franklin's comment of, it's a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. Right? We only get to keep it if we decide that it matters. And if it matters, we have to be able to work with people who don't think exactly like we think. And by the way, when we do, it's not only a richer experience, it's a better product. Overwhelmingly, every single time. When you find that bipartisan nature, it works. What I want to tip my hat to your organization on is, I know that the mindset matters. That the idea that you're trying to find that, and that's the starting point, as opposed to saying the starting point is to tell you what things we should do. You're instead saying, let's find an area where the public believes that there's common ground. So
absolutely. So you asked me, what do I see for the future? I still feel we have so much work to do to communicate this very profound finding that we have. That we agree on much more than we disagree, and to push against this narrative of polarization and division. It's actually very hard for people to accept it. Many people just reject it. They think, oh, well, isn't that nice? Or they must have asked the questions in a certain way, or that's nice, but it's not really relevant to today's world. So I think really my passion is to be getting this information out there and to help people start really internalizing it so that they can see the world differently, so that they can imagine, so that they become hopeful. One of my main goals is to create hope. And then, from there, you can have some optimism and create space for coming together and for making change. And, and I think on a practical level, we have to see, well, what are the practical truths or realities about this big gap we see from between what we all want and what we're actually seeing and getting in our politics. And I think it's not just about changing the people. I think it has to be the system. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, our whole organization is focused on the impact and opportunities of systems change. And I think that's what we're going to have to do in order to be able to find a solution that will represent Arizonans.
Well, and you also have to, I agree with you, this data, if we get the data out, if people begin to understand it, if they begin to see that there is hope for the system, that in itself is changing. That in itself begins to, politicians are a reflection of who they see. Now, the challenge for you is, my guess is that it's not going to get picked up on the nightly news more than once or twice, right? Because it's just not going to give them the sizzle of the divisions. So you're going to have to run more of a grassroots type effort. It's going to have to be on websites and social marketing and engaging people and going out and talking to people and giving presentations. But again, I'm going to come back to saying this. I'm deeply involved in the system changes. The system changes won't matter if we can't change the attitude, if we can't give people hope. And your organization is designed around giving them hope to believe that we can.
I think those things work together. Mm-hmm. I think, with systems change, people need to be, hopeful enough to go out and vote. So you have to make sure that those folks are voting. But right now, there's barriers to people voting that are very difficult to overcome the way the system is designed right now.
All right, Dr. Francis, if you would just put your website up again, or just tell us what your website is so that people can go to it and take a look.
Yes, it's Arizona Future, all one word, .org.
Okay. Dr. Francis, thank you so much for the great work that you all are doing. We deeply appreciate it. I deeply appreciate you. Thank you so much. And again, I enjoyed having you on The Optimistic American today.
Well, it's my pleasure. And as I said, I'm an optimist. And so I think we can do this. We can perfect our democracy, come together and create positive change. So I'm very excited about the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Obviously, we exist to rekindle the human spirit. If you like this content, go ahead and press that subscribe button, or leave us a comment, or talk about what it is that you disagree with us on. We really do read those comments. We appreciate the input, and we appreciate knowing what it is that you're thinking so we can make our product better. Again, this is Paul Johnson. We hope you enjoyed the show. Go to our website if you'd like more information at www.optamerican.com. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.